In the middle of the 15th century, across various regions of Europe, a rather peculiar wave of panic began to spread. People started believing that their genital organs were being stolen by witches and sorcerers. This belief transformed into a mass hysteria that affected thousands of individuals. And this hysteria led to the persecution and execution of hundreds of people. Now, let us examine this phenomenon slowly, carefully. From the beginning, the fear of genital theft did not appear suddenly. It had roots. Deep roots that extended back into ancient beliefs about magic, curses, and the vulnerability of the human body to supernatural forces. In medieval Europe, the body was understood very differently than we understand it today. The body was not just flesh and bone. It was a vessel. A battleground between divine and demonic forces. Every illness, every misfortune, every physical ailment could be the result of supernatural interference. The Church taught that demons were real. They were active. They walked among humans, causing mischief, spreading disease, tempting the faithful into sin. And these demons, the Church said, could work through human agents. Through witches. Through sorcerers. Through people who had made pacts with Satan. This was not metaphorical. This was literal theology. Church scholars debated the exact mechanisms by which demons could manipulate physical matter. Could a demon actually remove a body part? Or did they create an illusion? These were serious theological questions, discussed in universities, written about in lengthy Latin texts. The concept of maleficium, harmful magic, was well established in medieval legal and religious thought. Maleficium could cause crops to fail. It could make cows stop producing milk. It could make men impotent. And it could, according to some theologians, actually remove or hide male genitalia. Now, this belief was not unique to Europe. Similar fears existed in other cultures. In parts of Africa and Asia, there were traditional beliefs about genital theft or shrinkage caused by magical means. Anthropologists call this koro or genital retraction syndrome. But in medieval Europe, this fear took on a particular character, shaped by Christian demonology and the growing obsession with witchcraft. The fear became especially pronounced in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. This was a time of tremendous anxiety in Europe. The Black Death had killed perhaps 1/3 of the population. The Church was divided by schism. There were wars, famines, economic disruption. Social order seemed to be collapsing. In times of great anxiety, people look for explanations. They look for someone to blame. And in medieval Europe, that blame increasingly fell on witches. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book. The book was called Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. This book would become one of the most influential texts in the history of witch persecution. And it dedicated significant space to the question of whether witches could remove male genitalia. Let us consider what this book actually said. Slowly. Because the arguments it made were complex, and they reveal much about medieval thinking. The Malleus Maleficarum addressed a specific question: can witches actually remove the male member? Or do they merely create an illusion of removal? The authors debated this carefully. They cited earlier theologians. They referenced scripture. They discussed philosophical principles about the nature of matter and the limits of demonic power. Their conclusion was nuanced. They argued that witches, through the power of demons, could not actually remove the penis and carry it away. That would require the demon to create matter from nothing, or to truly destroy matter, which only God could do. However, they could create a very powerful glamour. An illusion so complete that the victim genuinely believed and perceived that his member had vanished. But the Malleus went further. It also discussed cases where witches allegedly collected male members and kept them. There is a famous passage, frequently cited in later discussions of this phenomenon, where the book describes a man who had lost his member approaching a witch to ask for it back. The witch, according to this account, told him to climb a certain tree where he would find a nest containing many members. He could take one. When he reached for a particularly large one, the witch told him no, not that one, it belonged to a parish priest. This story appears in the Malleus Maleficarum. It was written down, printed, and circulated throughout Europe. It was taken seriously by educated men, by lawyers, by judges, by inquisitors. Now, we must pause here and consider what this means. This was not folklore whispered by illiterate peasants. This was official theology, written by men with university degrees, approved by theological authorities, printed and distributed widely. The Malleus Maleficarum went through numerous editions. It was reprinted again and again. Between 1486 and 1600, it appeared in at least 13 editions. It was used as a handbook by witch hunters across Europe. And wherever it went, it spread the idea that witches could and did steal male genitalia. Now let us turn to specific cases. Documented instances where men accused women of stealing their members. These cases appear in trial records, in inquisitorial documents, in local court archives scattered across Europe. One of the earliest well-documented cases comes from the Tyrol region, in what is now Austria, in the year 1474. A man named Peter brought a formal accusation against a woman he claimed had used witchcraft to make his penis disappear. The case went to trial. Witnesses were called. The woman was questioned. The man was examined. The trial records are quite detailed. They record the man's testimony. He described how he had encountered the woman in the marketplace. They had some disagreement. The woman had touched his clothing. And immediately afterward, he felt a strange sensation. When he checked himself, he discovered that his member had vanished. The woman denied the accusation. She said she had done nothing. She was a Christian woman. She attended Massachusetts. She had no knowledge of witchcraft. But the judges took the accusation seriously. They questioned her extensively. They looked for evidence of witchcraft. They examined her body for witch marks. They asked neighbors about her reputation. In the end, the verdict is not entirely clear from the surviving records. But the case established a pattern. A man experiences impotence or believes his genitals have disappeared. He blames a woman he has had conflict with. He brings an accusation of witchcraft. The authorities investigate. This pattern repeated across Europe throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. In 1485, in the town of Ravensburg in southern Germany, multiple men came forward claiming their members had been stolen. There was panic. The town authorities launched an investigation. They arrested several women suspected of witchcraft. Under interrogation, which likely included torture, as was standard practice in witchcraft investigations, some of the women confessed. One woman, according to the trial records, confessed that she had indeed taken men's members. She described keeping them in a box. She said the devil had taught her this magic. She named other women who were also involved in this practice. Based on these confessions, the authorities arrested more women. The panic spread. In total, more than a dozen women were put on trial in Ravensburg for penis theft. Several were executed. Now, we must be very careful in how we interpret these confessions. Medieval trial procedures were deeply flawed. Torture was routine. Leading questions were used. The accused were under tremendous pressure to confess. They were often told that confessing was the only way to save their souls, even if their bodies were executed. So when we read that women confessed to keeping stolen penises in boxes, we cannot take this at face value. We are reading the product of a deeply coercive interrogation process, filtered through the preconceptions of the interrogators, recorded by scribes who believed in the reality of witchcraft. But what these records do tell us is that the fear was real. The authorities took it seriously. And women died because of it. By the late 15th century, the fear of penis theft had become widespread across parts of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. This was not a uniform panic. It appeared in waves. In certain towns, in certain years, there would be an outbreak of accusations. Then it would subside. Then it would flare up again elsewhere. The pattern suggests social contagion. When people in one town heard about cases in another town, they began to interpret their own experiences through this lens. A man experiencing impotence might previously have blamed it on illness, or stress, or divine punishment for his sins. But now, having heard stories about witch-caused penis theft, he blamed witchcraft instead. The role of printed materials cannot be overstated. This was the age of the printing press. Ideas could spread faster than ever before. The Malleus Maleficarum was printed and distributed. Pamphlets about witchcraft trials circulated. News of one town's witch panic reached other towns, and preachers spread these ideas from the pulpit. Many sermons from this period survive. They warn about the dangers of witchcraft. They tell stories of witches stealing children, spoiling harvests, causing storms, and yes, taking men's virility. In the Swiss city of Lucerne, in 1493, there was a particularly intense outbreak. Multiple men claimed their members had been taken. The city council took emergency measures. They issued proclamations against witchcraft. They increased night patrols. They encouraged citizens to report suspicious behavior. The atmosphere must have been extraordinary. Imagine living in this city at this time. Men checking themselves anxiously. Neighbors eyeing each other with suspicion. Old women who had always been regarded as a bit odd suddenly seeming dangerous. Any conflict, any argument, any misfortune could be interpreted as the result of witchcraft. One case from Lucerne is particularly well documented. A man named Johann accused his neighbor, an elderly widow named Agnes, of stealing his member. He claimed that after an argument about property boundaries, he had become impotent. He said he could see that his member was still there, but it did not function. It was, he testified, as if it were dead. This is interesting. Notice the nuance here. He did not claim it had completely vanished. He claimed it was present but non-functional. This was actually a common variation. Some men claimed total disappearance. Others claimed that the member was still visible but had become useless, as if it had been turned to dead flesh. The theological explanation for this was that the witch had not actually removed it, but had placed a glamour on it that prevented it from functioning. The man could still see it, but it was as if it belonged to someone else's body. It would not respond to his will. Agnes was arrested. She was elderly. She was poor. She was a widow, which meant she lacked male protection and was vulnerable to accusation. Under interrogation, she denied any involvement in witchcraft. She maintained her innocence. But Johann insisted. He brought other witnesses. Men who said they too had experienced problems after conflicts with Agnes. The case built against her. The outcome of Agnes's case is recorded in the city archives. She was found guilty. She was executed by burning. Her property was confiscated by the city. Johann's impotence, it should be noted, apparently did not immediately resolve after her execution. While these panics were occurring at the popular level, theologians and physicians were debating the phenomenon in scholarly terms. Their discussions reveal the complex interplay between religion, medicine, and folk belief in this period. Medical doctors of the 15th century had inherited theories about sexual function from ancient Greek and Arab physicians. According to humoral theory, which dominated medieval medicine, sexual function depended on the proper balance of bodily humors. An imbalance could cause impotence. Some physicians tried to provide natural explanations for the cases of perceived penis theft. They suggested that what men were experiencing was a form of temporary paralysis or shrinkage caused by cold, fear, or humoral imbalance. They noted that the penis could retract into the body under certain conditions, particularly in cold weather or when a man was frightened. One physician, a German doctor named Johannes Hartlieb, wrote a treatise in the 1450s addressing the question of witchcraft and sexual disorders. Hartlieb tried to walk a middle path. He acknowledged that witches existed and could cause harm. But he also argued that many supposed cases of magical interference were actually natural illnesses that could be treated with medicine. He described treating men who believed their members had been stolen by witches. His treatment involved warming medicines, massage, and reassurance. He claimed to have successfully restored function in many cases. But he had to be very careful in how he presented this. If he said too directly that witchcraft was not involved, he could be accused of denying the Church's teachings about demons. The theologians, meanwhile, continued to refine their theories. The debate centered on a philosophical problem: the nature of demonic power over matter. Everyone agreed that demons were real spiritual beings with significant power. But there were limits to this power. Demons could not create new matter. They could not truly change the essential nature of things. They could not perform genuine miracles, only God could do that. So when a witch, through demonic power, appeared to remove a penis, what was actually happening? Several theories were proposed. The illusion theory held that the demon created a glamour that affected the man's perception. The penis was still there, unchanged, but the man could not see or feel it correctly. This was the view favored by many scholastic theologians. It preserved God's unique power over matter while still allowing for dramatic demonic interference in human life. The transportation theory suggested that the demon could move the penis to another location, hide it, and then return it later. This seemed to explain stories about witches keeping collections of stolen members. But it raised difficult questions about how this worked physiologically. Could a man survive with his penis removed? Would it die if separated from his body? If it was hidden elsewhere, where exactly was elsewhere? The ligature theory, drawing on ancient texts, proposed that demons could tie spiritual knots that blocked the flow of vital spirits necessary for sexual function. The penis remained in place, but it could not function because the spiritual passages were blocked. This theory had the advantage of explaining why the member appeared to be present but dead. These debates might seem absurd to modern readers, but they were taken very seriously. They were conducted by intelligent, educated men using the best intellectual tools available to them. They were trying to reconcile theology, philosophy, medical knowledge, and reported experiences into a coherent system. And these theological debates had very real consequences. The conclusions reached by theologians informed the questions asked in witch trials. They shaped what confessions were considered believable. They determined which accusations would be taken seriously by courts. Underlying all of this was a deep anxiety about male sexual function. We need to understand this anxiety to make sense of the penis theft panic. In medieval and early modern Europe, masculinity was closely tied to sexual potency. A man's ability to perform sexually was not just a private matter. It was connected to his social status, his honor, his role as head of household. Marriage in this period was understood primarily as an institution for producing legitimate children. If a man could not consummate his marriage, the marriage could be annulled. This had serious social and economic consequences. A woman could petition for annulment on grounds of non-consummation. The man would be humiliated. His reputation would be destroyed. There are records of annulment proceedings where the court had to verify whether consummation had occurred. This sometimes involved embarrassingly direct examinations. Witnesses might be called to testify about whether they had seen evidence of sexual activity. In some cases, the couple was actually observed attempting to consummate the marriage in the presence of court officials. The fear of impotence was therefore not just about sex. It was about maintaining one's position in society. It was about avoiding shame. It was about preserving the ability to produce heirs. And impotence was, of course, a common problem. It had many causes: age, illness, stress, excessive drinking, relationship problems, performance anxiety. All the same factors that cause erectile dysfunction today. But medieval men did not have a framework for understanding these natural causes. Medical knowledge was limited. Psychology as we understand it did not exist. When a man experienced impotence, he needed an explanation. And witchcraft provided one. Blaming witchcraft had several advantages. First, it externalized the problem. It was not the man's fault. He was not weak or sinful or inadequate. He was the victim of malevolent magic. Second, it provided a clear enemy. There was someone to blame. Someone who could be punished. Third, it offered hope of remedy. If the curse could be identified and the witch could be forced to remove it, function could be restored. This psychological dynamic helps explain why so many men made these accusations. They were not necessarily lying or deliberately making false charges. They genuinely believed they had been cursed. Their belief was shaped by their culture, by what they had been taught about witchcraft, by the stories they had heard from preachers and neighbors. And once a man made such an accusation, social forces pushed the situation forward. The accused woman would be arrested. She would be interrogated. Under pressure, she might confess to things she had not done. Other women might be implicated. The original accuser would feel validated. The community's belief in the reality of witchcraft would be reinforced. We should note carefully that the vast majority of people accused in these cases were women. This was not coincidental. The witch hunts as a whole disproportionately targeted women, and accusations of sexual witchcraft were especially gendered. Why were women the primary targets? There were several interconnected reasons. First, medieval theology held that women were more susceptible to demonic influence than men. This was based on the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. Eve, the first woman, had been deceived by the serpent. Women were therefore seen as spiritually weaker, more easily tempted, more likely to fall into sin. Second, women's sexuality was regarded with suspicion and fear. Women were thought to have insatiable sexual appetites that men had to control. An unmarried woman, or a widow, or an older woman past childbearing age, might be sexually frustrated and therefore likely to turn to demons for satisfaction. Third, accusations of sexual witchcraft often arose from male sexual failure. When a man could not perform with a particular woman, he might claim she had cursed him. Or he might claim that another woman, out of jealousy, had cursed him to prevent him from being with his chosen partner. Either way, female agency and female sexuality were seen as threatening. Fourth, the women most often accused were those who were socially vulnerable. Elderly women, poor women, widows, women who lived alone, women who were quarrelsome or didn't conform to social expectations, women who practiced folk healing or midwifery, which could be interpreted as having magical knowledge. In the specific context of penis theft accusations, there was often a narrative of sexual rejection. A man would make advances toward a woman. She would reject him. He would then find himself impotent. He would conclude that she had cursed him out of spite. Or alternatively, a man would end a relationship with a woman. She would be angry. Later, he would experience impotence. He would blame her vengeance. These narratives reveal a deep anxiety about women's power to reject or judge male sexuality. The accusation of witchcraft was, in a sense, a way of reasserting male control. The woman who had rejected or angered a man would be punished. She would be arrested, tried, possibly executed. The social order, with men dominant, would be restored. Modern medical anthropologists have noted similarities between the European penis theft panic and a phenomenon found in other cultures, particularly in parts of Asia and Africa. This phenomenon is called Koro, or genital retraction syndrome. Koro is a culture-bound syndrome where individuals become convinced that their genitals are retracting into their body and that this will result in death. Epidemics of Koro have been documented in China, Singapore, Thailand, India, and parts of West Africa. During a Koro epidemic, large numbers of people, predominantly men, suddenly become convinced their genitals are shrinking or disappearing. They take drastic measures to prevent this. In documented cases, men have tied strings around their penises, or clamped them with clothespins, or asked family members to hold onto them to prevent retraction. The parallels to the European penis theft panic are striking. In both cases, we see mass anxiety focused on male genitalia. In both cases, individuals genuinely perceive changes to their bodies that outside observers cannot verify. In both cases, the phenomenon spreads through social contagion in times of stress. But there are also important differences. Koro is typically attributed to supernatural causes like ghosts or spirits, but it does not usually involve accusations against specific human beings. The European penis theft panic, by contrast, led to witch trials and executions. It was not just about personal anxiety, but about finding and punishing those responsible. Some researchers have suggested that what medieval Europeans experienced was essentially Koro, but filtered through their particular cultural and religious framework. Instead of fearing spontaneous retraction, they feared theft by witches. This interpretation sees the phenomenon as a universal human psychological vulnerability that manifests differently in different cultural contexts. Other researchers emphasize the differences. They argue that the European cases were shaped by specific historical factors: the theology of witchcraft, the legal structures of witch trials, gender dynamics of patriarchal society, economic tensions in communities undergoing change. Probably both perspectives capture part of the truth. There may be some underlying psychological mechanism that makes humans vulnerable to anxiety about genital integrity, especially during periods of social stress. But the specific form this anxiety takes, and especially the social consequences, are shaped by culture and history. The penis theft panic did not last forever. By the late 16th century, such accusations were becoming less common in most parts of Europe. By the 17th century, they had largely ceased. Why did the panic decline? Several factors were involved. First, the broader witch hunts were beginning to face criticism. Educated voices, including some Catholic and Protestant theologians, began questioning whether the witch trials had gotten out of hand. They pointed to the many obviously false confessions extracted under torture. They noted the lack of actual evidence for many of the alleged magical crimes. A few particularly influential skeptical works appeared. In 1563, Johann Weyer, a Dutch physician, published De Prestigiis Daemonum, on the illusions of demons. Weyer argued that many supposed witches were actually mentally ill women who falsely believed they had magical powers. He specifically addressed the question of sexual witchcraft, suggesting that impotence had natural medical causes and that blaming witches was both cruel and medically counterproductive. Weyer's work was controversial. It was placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Forbidden Books. Many theologians attacked him. But his arguments circulated. They influenced other thinkers. Gradually, the intellectual climate began to shift. Second, medical understanding of sexual function was slowly improving. Physicians were developing better anatomical knowledge. They were conducting post-mortem examinations. They were publishing treatises on sexual disorders with more naturalistic explanations. This didn't mean people stopped believing in witchcraft. Belief in witchcraft persisted well into the 18th century in many parts of Europe. But the specific claims about penis theft became harder to sustain as medical knowledge advanced. Doctors could examine men who claimed their members had been stolen and demonstrate that the anatomy was intact and functional. Third, legal standards were changing. Courts were becoming more skeptical of witchcraft accusations. They were requiring better evidence. They were questioning the reliability of confessions obtained under torture. The legal procedures that had enabled witch trials were being reformed. In some jurisdictions, the death penalty for witchcraft was abolished. In others, it became much harder to secure a conviction. Accusations that would have led to execution in 1500 might result in acquittal or a light sentence in 1650. Fourth, the religious certainty of the early Reformation period was giving way to something more complex. After more than a century of religious warfare, many Europeans were exhausted. There was a growing sense that perhaps not every theological claim needed to be enforced with absolute rigor. A certain pragmatic skepticism was emerging. This didn't mean Europe was becoming secular or rationalist. That would take much longer. But there was a slight loosening of the grip of religious terror. By 1700, the idea that witches stole penises had become something of an embarrassment to educated Europeans. It was seen as a superstition, a relic of a darker, more credulous age. Writers referred to it as an example of medieval ignorance. But we should note that belief in witchcraft itself persisted much longer. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782. Folk beliefs in witches and magical curses continued in rural areas into the 19th and even 20th centuries. And the underlying anxieties never fully went away. Male sexual anxiety remained. The fear of impotence remained. Only the explanatory framework changed. Instead of blaming witches, men would eventually blame psychological factors, or medical conditions, or relationship problems. The anxiety found new expressions. How should we understand this episode of European history? What does it tell us about medieval society, about psychology, about the dynamics of mass panic? Historians and anthropologists have offered various interpretations. One interpretation emphasizes the role of misogyny and patriarchal social structure. From this perspective, the penis theft panic was fundamentally about controlling women. In a society where male dominance was maintained partly through claims of sexual superiority, any threat to male sexual function was intolerable. Accusations of sexual witchcraft served to punish women who challenged male authority, whether through sexual rejection, economic independence, or simply being old and poor and therefore vulnerable. This interpretation is supported by the overwhelmingly gendered nature of the accusations. It was almost always women who were accused, and almost always men who made the accusations. The panic reinforced the message that women's sexuality was dangerous and needed to be controlled. Another interpretation focuses on the psychology of mass hysteria and social contagion. From this view, The penis theft panic was an example of how beliefs can spread through a population during times of stress. People were primed by their religious teachings to believe in witchcraft. They lived in an age of anxiety and uncertainty. When a few individuals made claims about magical penis theft, these claims resonated with others' fears. The phenomenon spread through suggestion and imitation. This interpretation is supported by the wave-like pattern of the panic, outbreaks in particular towns and regions, spreading to neighboring areas, then subsiding, only to flare up again elsewhere later. A third interpretation emphasizes the role of cultural meaning-making. From this perspective, the penis theft panic was a way that medieval people made sense of disturbing experiences. Impotence was common, poorly understood, and deeply threatening to masculine identity. The witchcraft explanation provided a culturally coherent way to interpret these experiences. It gave sufferers a framework for understanding what was happening to them, a language for describing their distress, and a potential remedy through identifying and punishing the witch responsible. A fourth interpretation looks at the political economy of witch accusations. Many historians have noted that witch trials often occurred in communities undergoing economic stress or social change. Accusations frequently targeted women who were economic burdens on their communities. Elderly widows without family support, for instance. The witch trial provided a mechanism for eliminating these burdens while also reinforcing social norms. In the case of penis theft accusations, there may have been an economic dimension. A man who could claim he had been cursed and made impotent might use this to escape an unwanted marriage contract. Or a community might use such accusations to target women whose land or property they coveted. Each of these interpretations captures something true about the phenomenon. The penis theft panic was simultaneously about gender and power, about psychology and social contagion, about cultural meaning-making, and about political economy. These factors were all interconnected. The penis theft panic was not the only episode of mass hysteria in European history. Understanding it in comparison with other panics can illuminate what was unique about it and what it shared with similar phenomena. Consider the dancing plague of 1518, in Strasbourg, where hundreds of people danced compulsively for days, some until they collapsed or died. This was clearly a case of mass psychogenic illness, spreading through social contagion. But unlike the penis theft panic, it did not lead to accusations and trials. The dancers were seen as victims, not as perpetrators. Or consider the numerous blood libel accusations against Jews throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Claims that Jews kidnapped Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. These were false accusations, based on prejudice and resulting in violence. Like the penis theft panic, they arose from anxiety, spread through social contagion, and led to persecution of a marginalized group. The similarity in structure is striking. Or the werewolf trials of the 16th century, where individuals were accused of transforming into wolves and attacking people. These trials followed similar patterns to witchcraft trials: accusations, torture, confession, execution. They arose from similar theological frameworks about demonic power and human malevolence. Or the witch-finder episodes in England and Scotland in the 17th century, where professional witch hunters traveled from town to town, using various tests to identify witches. These created local panics wherever they went. Or later, the Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts in 1692, where mass hysteria among a group of young girls led to accusations, trials, and executions. All of these episodes share certain features: a background of social stress and anxiety, a belief system that makes certain types of supernatural threats seem plausible, an initial trigger event or accusation, social contagion spreading the panic to others, authority figures, religious or legal, who take the claim seriously and provide institutional support, scapegoating of vulnerable groups. Eventually, some resolution where the panic subsides and authorities become more skeptical. The penis theft panic fits this pattern. What made it distinctive was its specific focus on male sexual anxiety and its explicit sexual content. This created particular dynamics. The gendered nature of accusations, the shame and secrecy surrounding the initial complaints, the theological complications around discussing sexual matters. We need to spend some time discussing the confessions. Many of the women accused of penis theft confessed. Some confessions were extraordinarily detailed. Women described how they collected male members, where they kept them, how many they had, who had taught them this magic. But we must understand how these confessions were obtained. Torture was standard procedure in continental European courts dealing with serious crimes, including witchcraft. The theory was that torture was necessary to obtain truth from hardened criminals who would otherwise refuse to confess. There were rules about when and how torture could be applied, but in practice these rules were often ignored or interpreted very loosely. The most common form of torture was the strappado. The accused hands were tied behind their back, attached to a rope, and then they were hoisted into the air, suspended by their arms. This caused excruciating pain in the shoulders. Sometimes weights were added to their feet to increase the pain. The accused might be dropped suddenly, causing further injury. Other methods included crushing the legs in a device called the boot, crushing the fingers or thumbs in thumbscrews, sleep deprivation, and the rack which stretched the body. Under this kind of pain, people will confess to almost anything. They will tell their interrogators whatever they think the interrogators want to hear, in the desperate hope that the pain will stop. Moreover, the interrogators had specific ideas about what witches did. They asked leading questions. You collected men's members, didn't you? Where did you keep them? How many did you have? An accused woman, in terrible pain, would eventually say yes, she had collected them, she kept them in a box, she had 20 of them, or whatever number seemed to satisfy her torturers. The confessions, then, tell us more about what the interrogators believed than about what the accused women actually did. They are documents of torture, not of truth. And yet, these confessions were written down, recorded in official court documents, and taken as proof. They circulated. Other courts read them and saw confirmation that penis theft really occurred. Other interrogators used them as templates for what questions to ask. This created a feedback loop. Confessions shaped beliefs, which shaped subsequent interrogations, which produced more confessions matching the expected pattern. Some women did confess without being tortured, or before torture was applied. Does this make their confessions more reliable? Not necessarily. The threat of torture was often enough. An accused woman might confess hoping to avoid torture, or hoping for a lighter sentence, or because she had been worn down by days of imprisonment and interrogation. Some accused women may have been mentally ill, experiencing delusions that made them genuinely believe they had magical powers. Medieval Europeans did not have our understanding of mental illness. A woman suffering from schizophrenia or severe depression with psychotic features might make bizarre claims that would be interpreted as confessions of witchcraft. Some women may have confessed out of despair or a desire for attention. In a society that largely ignored and marginalized elderly poor women, being the center of a major trial might have held a perverse appeal for some, even if it meant execution. But most of the confessions were simply products of torture and fear. We should read them with great skepticism and compassion for the women who were forced to speak them. A question that often arises: did people really believe this? Did medieval Europeans genuinely think that witches stole penises and kept them in nests in trees? The answer is complex. Belief is not simple or uniform. Certainly, some people believed these claims literally and completely. The inquisitors who wrote the Malleus Maleficarum believed. The judges who sentenced women to death believed. The men who made accusations believed, at least in the moment of their accusation. But belief existed on a spectrum. Some people were fully convinced. Others had doubts but went along with the proceedings because everyone else seemed to believe, or because questioning witchcraft accusations was itself dangerous. Still others were privately skeptical but participated for other reasons: professional duty, social pressure, personal animosity toward the accused. We also need to distinguish between intellectual belief and emotional or experiential belief. A man might intellectually accept church teaching about demons and witchcraft. But when he himself experiences impotence, the visceral reality of that experience, the shame and fear it generates, might make him absolutely certain that he has been cursed. His certainty would not be based on careful reasoning but on the intensity of his emotional distress. Similarly, a community experiencing a witch panic might not sit down and carefully evaluate evidence. They would be caught up in collective emotion, fear, anger, the excitement of scandal and drama. In that state, wild claims might seem plausible simply because everyone else seems to accept them and because they fit with existing cultural narratives about witchcraft. It's worth noting that some people expressed skepticism even during the height of the witch hunts. There are records of individuals refusing to testify against accused witches, or judges who were reluctant to convict, or communities that resisted witch hunters' attempts to stir up panic. But expressing skepticism was risky. It could lead to accusations that the skeptic was defending witches, perhaps because they were in league with them. So skepticism, when it existed, was often expressed privately or carefully. And belief could be contextual. The same person might believe wholeheartedly in witchcraft when listening to a sermon in church, feel skeptical when considering a specific accusation against a neighbor they knew well, and then swing back to belief when surrounded by an anxious crowd convinced that witches were active in their community. Humans are capable of holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. A medieval peasant might believe that witches existed and could cause harm, while also believing that a specific accusation against a specific woman was motivated by personal grudge rather than genuine witchcraft. These two beliefs could coexist without necessarily causing cognitive dissonance. It's also important to recognize that belief, in this context, meant something different than it might mean today. Medieval Europeans did not have our post-Enlightenment framework of empirical verification. They did not think in terms of hypothesis testing or reproducible experiments. Their epistemology, their way of knowing what was true, was based on authority, tradition, and revelation. If the Church said demons existed and could work through witches, then demons existed and could work through witches. If learned theologians wrote books explaining how witches stole penises, then that was how it worked. The question was not whether such things could happen, but whether they had happened in this particular case. This is why arguing about whether medieval people really believed can be misleading. They inhabited a different conceptual universe. Their categories for understanding reality were different from ours. What we call superstition was, for them, simply how the world worked. We should consider the economic dimensions of these accusations. Witch trials were not just about belief and fear. They were also embedded in economic relationships and often had economic consequences. Many of the women accused of witchcraft, including penis theft, were poor. They were widows without male relatives to protect them. They were elderly women who could no longer work and had to rely on charity. They were midwives or healers who occupied an ambiguous social position. They were women who had inherited small amounts of property that others coveted. In medieval and early modern communities, there was a constant tension around the question of who should support those who could not support themselves. The elderly, the disabled, widows without family, these people needed help to survive. Christian teaching emphasized charity. But resources were limited, especially in times of crop failure or economic downturn. An accusation of witchcraft could resolve this tension. If an elderly widow was convicted and executed, she was no longer a burden on the community. Her small property, such as it was, would be confiscated. The community was rid of her. This is not to say that economic motives were always primary or even conscious. But they were present. Historians analyzing witch trial patterns have found correlations between economic stress and increased accusations. Periods of bad harvests, high prices, and economic uncertainty saw more witch trials. In the specific case of penis theft accusations, there could be economic angles. A man who successfully accused a woman of cursing him might avoid an arranged marriage that he found economically disadvantageous. Or he might redirect blame for his own sexual inadequacy in a way that preserved his reputation and thus his economic prospects. A community might use penis theft accusations as part of a broader pattern of scapegoating. If things were going wrong, if crops were failing, if there was disease, if there was general misfortune, finding a witch to blame provided both psychological relief and a practical target for action. The accused women's poverty made them vulnerable. They could not hire lawyers. They did not have powerful relatives to intervene. They could not offer bribes. They had no social capital to draw on. When accused, they had few resources to defend themselves. And the authorities who prosecuted them sometimes profited. In some jurisdictions, the property of convicted witches was divided between the court and the local authorities. Witch hunters might be paid per conviction. Even the executioner received a fee. There was a whole economy around witch trials. This does not mean that everyone involved was cynically motivated by greed. Most people who participated in witch trials probably believed they were doing necessary work to protect the community from genuine supernatural threats. But economic factors shaped who was vulnerable to accusation, who could defend themselves, and who had incentives to pursue prosecution. Let us try to imagine, for a moment, what it was like to be one of these accused women. This requires empathy and imagination, because the sources we have, court records, confessions, theological treatises, were all written by the accusers and prosecutors, not by the accused themselves. Imagine you are an elderly woman living in a small town in southern Germany in the year 1485. You are a widow. Your husband died 5 years ago. You have no children, or your children have moved away. You live alone in a small house. You get by through spinning wool, perhaps, or doing odd jobs, and through the charity of neighbors. You are not popular. You have a sharp tongue. You have quarreled with neighbors over the years. About property boundaries, about debts, about small slights and insults. This is normal. Everyone in a small community has conflicts. But in your case, these conflicts accumulate. People remember your angry words. They note that bad things sometimes happen to those who cross you, though of course bad things happen to everyone sometimes. One day, you hear that a man in the town has made an accusation. He says his penis has been stolen by witchcraft. There is talk. Who could have done this? People remember the quarrels. Someone mentions your name. You hear about this through gossip. You feel afraid. A few days later, the authorities come to your house. They arrest you. You are taken to a cell. You are frightened, confused. You do not understand exactly what is happening. The charge is explained to you, witchcraft, specifically, stealing a man's member through demonic magic. You deny it. Of course you deny it. You have done nothing. You are a Christian woman. You attend Mass when you can. You say your prayers. You know nothing of witchcraft. But your denials are not believed. You are questioned, again and again. The same questions repeated. Did you make a pact with the devil? How do you curse people? Where do you keep the stolen members? You keep saying no, you know nothing about this, you have done nothing wrong. The interrogators become frustrated with your denials. They begin to speak of torture. They describe what will happen to you. The pain you will feel. They say that if you confess, it will go easier for you. You will save your soul even if your body must be punished. You are old. You are in pain already from arthritis and a lifetime of hard physical labor. The thought of being tortured is unbearable. But you have nothing to confess. You have done nothing. Then the torture begins. The pain is beyond anything you have experienced. You scream. You beg for it to stop. They ask you again, did you curse this man? Did you take his member? You say no, no, please stop. The pain continues. Finally, you break. You will say anything to make it stop. Yes, you say. Yes, I cursed him. Yes, I took his member. They want details. How did you do it? You don't know what to say. You make something up. You say the devil taught you. They want more. You elaborate, saying whatever seems to satisfy them. You describe keeping the stolen member in a box, because they seem to expect this. They ask if there are others involved. You are in such pain and confusion that you name names, other women, perhaps women you dislike, or perhaps just the first names that come to mind. Eventually the torture stops. You are returned to your cell. You are in agony. Your body is broken. You have confessed to things you did not do and implicated others who are probably innocent. The trial proceeds. Your confession is read out. You are found guilty. You are sentenced to death. You are taken to be burned. In your final moments, you might insist on your innocence, or you might be too broken to speak, or you might desperately repeat the confession in the hope that it will somehow help, though it cannot. This is what happened to many women. Not all cases involved torture, some did not. Not all ended in execution, some ended in lesser punishments, some in acquittal. But the pattern above was common enough that hundreds, perhaps thousands of women experienced something like it. When we read the dry court records, the formal language of indictments and sentences, we should remember that behind each case was a human being experiencing terror, pain, and injustice. We should also try to understand the psychological reality of the men who made these accusations. It is easy to see them as villains, as men who knowingly made false accusations to harm women. Some may have been exactly that. But many, probably most, genuinely believed they had been cursed. Consider what it was like to be a man in medieval Europe experiencing impotence. You live in a society where your masculinity, your social standing, your very identity is tied to your ability to perform sexually and father children. Your marriage might depend on it. Your inheritance might depend on it. Your reputation certainly depends on it. And then, suddenly, you cannot perform. You try, and your body does not respond. This is terrifying. This is shameful. You cannot talk about it openly. Sexual matters are not discussed in polite company. You are isolated with your fear and shame. You need an explanation. Why is this happening? You are not old. You are not ill, as far as you know. You search for a cause. And then you remember, you had an argument with a woman recently. She was angry with you. She said some sharp words. Could she have cursed you? The more you think about it, the more certain you become. The timing fits. She had a motive, you offended her. And you have heard stories. You have heard sermons about witches who curse men's virility. You have heard about other cases. Your impotence is not your fault. You are a victim of malevolent magic. This belief actually provides relief. It externalizes the problem. It gives you something to do. You can make an accusation, seek justice, perhaps get the curse removed. The alternative. Accepting that you simply have a sexual dysfunction with no clear cause and no clear remedy, is much harder to bear. Once you have convinced yourself that you have been cursed, confirmation bias reinforces this belief. Every time you fail to perform, it confirms the curse. If you occasionally succeed, you interpret it as the curse being temporarily weakened. Everything fits the narrative you have constructed. And when you make the accusation, you find that others believe you. The authorities take you seriously. The woman is arrested. Your belief is validated by the social response. You are not crazy or wrong. Look, they are investigating, they are finding evidence, other people are coming forward with similar stories. By the time the accused woman is convicted and executed, you may be absolutely certain of her guilt. You may feel that justice has been done. You may even feel gratitude that the authorities protected you from this dangerous witch. This is how belief works. It is not always cynical or calculated. It can be sincere and self-reinforcing. The men who made these accusations were not necessarily evil. They were humans in distress, interpreting their experiences through the conceptual frameworks available to them in their culture. This does not make them blameless. They participated in a system that killed innocent people. They made accusations that destroyed lives. But understanding their psychology helps us understand how such systems can function. It is not just about a few evil individuals. It is about how ordinary people, in certain circumstances, can participate in terrible injustice while believing they are doing the right thing. We have focused primarily on the accusers and the accused. But there were others involved in these cases. Witnesses, community members, and sometimes, children. In some penis theft cases, children were called as witnesses. They might testify that they saw the accused woman muttering strange words, or making odd gestures, or possessing suspicious objects. Children's testimony was given weight in witch trials, based on the belief that children were innocent and therefore less likely to lie. But children are highly suggestible. They want to please adults. They pick up on what adults expect them to say. If an adult asks a child, "Did you see the old woman doing anything strange?" the child might remember or imagine something that fits what the adult seems to be looking for. Moreover, children in medieval Europe were taught from a young age about the dangers of witchcraft. They heard stories. They learned to be afraid of certain women. When a witch panic occurred in their community, they were primed to see sinister significance in ordinary behavior. Some historians have suggested that children sometimes made accusations as a way of gaining attention or power in an adult world that normally gave them little of either. A child who claimed to have witnessed witchcraft became important. Adults listened. The child was questioned. Their words were written down. This could be intoxicating. The role of children in witch panics would become especially prominent in later cases, like the Salem witch trials of 1692, where the accusations of a group of young girls triggered the whole episode. But even in earlier penis theft cases, children sometimes played a part. Beyond children, there were adult witnesses. Neighbors who testified about the accused woman's reputation. People who claimed they had seen her in suspicious circumstances. Those who reported that bad things happened to people who crossed her. These witnesses were not neutral observers. They were embedded in the social relationships of their community. They had their own grievances, their own fears, their own reasons for participating in the trial. Some genuinely believed they were helping to identify a witch. Others might have been settling old scores. Still others might have testified because they felt pressured to do so. A witness who refused to testify against an accused witch might themselves fall under suspicion. Why would you defend a witch unless you were connected to witchcraft yourself? This created pressure to participate in accusations, even if one had doubts. The community as a whole became involved. Witch trials were public spectacles. People gathered to watch interrogations, trials, executions. They discussed the case endlessly. They took sides. Some defended the accused, others called for harsh punishment. These trials divided communities. They created lasting animosities. Families of the accused might be ostracized for years afterward. Those who had testified against the accused might feel guilt later, but were trapped by what they had said. The wounds created by witch trials could last for generations. The penis theft panic was not uniform across Europe. It appeared with different intensity in different regions. Understanding these geographic variations can help us understand the phenomenon. The panic was most intense in the German-speaking regions of Central Europe, parts of modern Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. This was also the region where witch trials in general were most numerous and most severe during the 15th and 16th centuries. Why was this region particularly affected? Several factors may have contributed. First, this region was politically fragmented. Unlike France or England, which had centralized monarchies, the Holy Roman Empire consisted of hundreds of small territories, free cities, bishoprics, principalities, duchies. Each had its own courts and laws. There was no central authority to moderate witch hunting. If one jurisdiction began aggressive prosecution of witches, neighboring jurisdictions might feel pressure to do likewise, or might compete to show they were equally vigilant against evil. Second, this region was experiencing intense religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation began in Germany in 1517. The following decades saw warfare, persecution, and tremendous anxiety about religious truth. Both Catholics and Protestants believed they were fighting against the devil's forces. Both saw witchcraft as a real and present danger. The religious conflict intensified fears of supernatural evil. Third, this region had a particular legal tradition. The inquisitorial system, which actively investigated crimes rather than waiting for accusations, combined with the use of torture to extract confessions, created a machinery well suited to generating witch trials. Once this machinery was in place and focused on witchcraft, it produced a steady stream of cases. Fourth, this region had a strong tradition of learned demonology. German universities produced many of the theological works on witchcraft, including the Malleus Maleficarum. These works circulated among educated elites and influenced how courts approached witchcraft cases. In contrast, in regions like England and Scandinavia, penis theft accusations were rare or absent. These regions had witch trials, but they took different forms. English witch trials, for instance, rarely involved torture and focused more on accusations of causing death or harm through curses rather than on elaborate Sabbaths or sexual witchcraft. Why were these regions less affected by penis theft panic? Partly due to different legal systems, England did not use torture in witch trials. Partly due to different theological emphases, English Protestantism was less concerned with elaborate demonology. Partly due to different social structures and different cultural attitudes toward sexuality and masculinity. Spain and Italy had extensive witch trials, but penis theft accusations were relatively uncommon there as well. The Spanish Inquisition, ironically, was actually relatively skeptical of witch accusations and set high standards for conviction. Italian trials tended to focus on different aspects of witchcraft. France had significant witch trials, and some cases of sexual witchcraft, but penis theft accusations were less prominent than in German-speaking regions. This geographic variation reminds us that the penis theft panic was not inevitable. It required a specific combination of legal, religious, social, and cultural factors to flourish. In regions where those factors were not all present, the panic either did not occur or took different forms. The penis theft panic left traces in literature and art, though these traces are often obscure and require careful interpretation. Some medieval and Renaissance literature made oblique references to sexual witchcraft. In poems, plays, and prose works, there are mentions of witches who make men impotent, who steal virility, who keep collections of male members. These references were sometimes played for dark humor, sometimes presented as genuine warnings. For example, in some collections of tales and jests that circulated in the 16th century, there are comic stories about men who lose their members to witches and have to negotiate to get them back. These stories treat the subject with a mixture of fear and mockery. They acknowledge the belief while also making light of it. The story from the Malleus Maleficarum about the witch who kept members in a tree, where a man tried to take the largest one and was told it belonged to a priest, was repeated in various forms. It appeared in jest books, in sermons as a cautionary tale, in legal commentaries. It became a kind of folkloric motif, detached from any specific trial but expressing cultural anxieties about witchcraft and sexuality. In visual art, there are occasional depictions of witches that may relate to these beliefs. Some paintings and woodcuts show witches with collections of strange objects. Some show scenes of men being cursed or afflicted. These images usually do not explicitly depict penis theft. Visual representation of such subject matter would have been too scandalous. But knowledgeable viewers might have understood the implications. Later, as the witch hunts became historical rather than contemporary events, they began to appear in historical literature and art. Enlightenment writers sometimes cited the penis theft accusations as examples of medieval superstition and credulity. They used these stories to demonstrate how far Europe had progressed from the darkness of earlier times. 19th-century Romantic writers and artists, fascinated by the medieval period, sometimes included witches in their works. But they tended to portray witches as tragic or mysterious figures rather than focusing on specific accusations like penis theft. In the 20th century, as historians began seriously studying the witch hunts, the penis theft panic appeared in academic works. It became a subject of scholarly analysis rather than belief or entertainment. More recently, the phenomenon has appeared in popular culture occasionally, in historical fiction, in documentaries, in discussions of mass hysteria. It is usually presented as an example of how strange and irrational people in the past could be. But this literary and artistic legacy is relatively thin compared to other aspects of witch belief. The penis theft panic did not generate the kind of memorable literature that some other aspects of witchcraft did. Perhaps the subject matter was too specific, too embarrassing, or too difficult to represent in art. It remained somewhat marginal even within the broader witch panic. As we come toward the end of this long examination of the medieval penis theft panic, it is worth considering what lessons this historical episode might hold. First, it demonstrates the power of belief systems to shape perception. The men who believed their penises had been stolen were not simply lying. In many cases, they genuinely perceived something wrong. Their cultural framework told them to interpret certain experiences as witchcraft, and so they did. This reminds us that perception is not purely objective, it is filtered through cultural and psychological lenses. Second, it shows how social contagion can spread belief and behavior. The panic spread through communities, through regions. People heard about cases and then interpreted their own experiences similarly. This pattern of social contagion appears in many historical episodes of mass panic and collective delusion. It appears in modern cases too. Moral panics, urban legends, conspiracy theories. Understanding historical cases helps us recognize the pattern when it appears in contemporary forms. Third, it illustrates the danger of systems that assume guilt and use coercion to extract confessions. The use of torture in witch trials produced confessions that confirmed prosecutors' pre-existing beliefs. The confessions then validated the beliefs, leading to more trials and more torture. This vicious cycle could only be broken by changing the legal system itself. This has implications for how we think about criminal justice, interrogation practices, and the reliability of confessions. Fourth, it reveals how marginalized groups become scapegoats during times of social stress. The women accused of penis theft were disproportionately poor, elderly, socially isolated. They were convenient targets for blame. This pattern repeats throughout history. In times of plague, economic crisis, or social change, societies often turn on their most vulnerable members. Recognizing this pattern might help us resist it. Fifth, it shows how patriarchal systems used accusations of sexual deviance to control women. The penis theft accusations were fundamentally about male anxiety and male power. Women who were seen as threatening male sexual or social dominance were vulnerable to accusations. This gendered dynamic was not unique to penis theft. It appeared in many forms of witch accusation. Understanding this historical pattern helps us recognize similar dynamics today. Sixth, it demonstrates that even highly educated, intelligent people can hold beliefs that seem absurd from a later perspective. The theologians and lawyers who took penis theft accusations seriously were not stupid. They were working within the best intellectual frameworks available to them. This should make us humble about our own certainties. Future generations may look back at some of our firmly held beliefs with equal incredulity. Seventh, it shows the importance of skepticism and the willingness to question authority. The penis theft panic eventually ended partly because some individuals had the courage to express doubt, to question whether the witch trials were just, to propose alternative explanations. Johann Weyer and other skeptics faced criticism and danger, but their dissent was crucial. This reminds us of the value of free inquiry and the danger of orthodoxies that cannot be questioned. Eighth, it illustrates how economic and political factors intertwine with belief and ideology. The witch trials were not purely about belief in witchcraft. They were also about property, social order, gender relations, community tensions. Understanding historical events requires attention to these multiple dimensions. Ideas do not float free from material reality. They are always embedded in social relationships and structures. Ninth, It demonstrates that mass injustice requires widespread participation. The witch trials were not carried out by a few fanatics. They involved accusers, witnesses, judges, executioners, communities of spectators. Many people participated, and most probably believed they were doing the right thing. This is a sobering reminder that ordinary people can participate in terrible things without being monsters. It suggests the importance of examining our own participation in systems of harm. 10th, and perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that beliefs have consequences. The penis theft panic was not just an interesting historical curiosity. It led to real suffering and death for hundreds of people. Ideas about witchcraft, demons, and sexual magic translated directly into torture chambers and execution pyres. This is true of many belief systems throughout history. What people believe matters because it affects how they act toward others. Although the specific fear of penis theft by witches no longer exists in Europe, some aspects of the phenomenon have modern echoes. Medical anthropologists have documented modern cases of Koro in various parts of the world. In 1967, there was a Koro epidemic in Singapore. In 1976, another epidemic in Thailand. In 1982, in northeast India. In each case, large numbers of men became convinced their genitals were retracting and sought medical help. These epidemics showed the same pattern of social contagion as the medieval European cases, though without the accusations of witchcraft or the persecution of women. More broadly, contemporary societies still experience periodic moral panics that share structural similarities with the penis theft panic. The satanic ritual abuse panic of the 1980s and 1990s in the United States and other countries bears remarkable similarities. Accusations of organized satanic cults abusing children spread rapidly despite lack of evidence. Coercive interrogation techniques were used with children, leading to elaborate accusations. Innocent people were imprisoned. Eventually, most cases were revealed to be unfounded, products of suggestive questioning, false memory, and mass hysteria. The phenomenon of mass psychogenic illness continues to occur. There have been modern cases of groups of people experiencing mysterious symptoms, fainting, seizures, unusual movements, that spread through social contagion without an identifiable medical cause. These cases often occur in schools or workplaces, affecting primarily young women or girls. The pattern resembles medieval dancing plagues and other episodes of collective behavior. Internet-fueled conspiracy theories show similar patterns of belief spreading through social networks, with believers interpreting ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm their pre-existing theories, and with those who express skepticism being viewed with suspicion. Moral panics around sexuality continue. Fears about sexual predators, about sexual content in media, about various sexual practices deemed deviant. These panics mobilize many of the same psychological and social mechanisms that operated in the penis theft panic. The scapegoating of marginalized groups during times of stress continues. Immigrants, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, gender and sexual minorities, various groups become targets of suspicion and blame when societies are anxious. The specific content changes, but the structure remains similar. Modern legal systems in many countries have moved away from coercive interrogation and have better protections against false confessions, but problems remain. Even without physical torture, psychological pressure in interrogations can lead to false confessions. The question of how to distinguish genuine reports from false ones remains difficult. Social media has created new mechanisms for social contagion of beliefs. Information, and misinformation, can spread globally within hours. Communities can form around shared beliefs and reinforce each other's certainty. Echo chambers can make extreme beliefs seem normal. The speed and reach of modern communication amplifies these effects in ways medieval Europeans could not have imagined. None of this means we have not made progress. We have. Modern societies generally have better legal protections, more rigorous standards of evidence, greater religious tolerance, more skeptical attitudes toward supernatural claims. But the underlying human psychological and social vulnerabilities that made the penis theft panic possible have not disappeared. The medieval penis theft panic gradually faded away over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. By 1700, such accusations had become rare. By 1800, they had essentially ceased in Europe. What replaced them? Several things. First, alternative explanations for impotence. Medical understanding improved slowly. Doctors developed more naturalistic accounts of sexual dysfunction. These accounts were still limited and often wrong by modern standards, but they provided non-magical frameworks for understanding the problem. Second, changing attitudes toward sexuality. Over time, there was a gradual shift toward viewing sexuality as a more private matter. The intense public concern with everyone's sexual behavior that characterized medieval and early modern Europe slowly gave way to a notion that sexual matters were personal. This reduced the social pressure on men to publicly explain or justify sexual problems. Third, the decline of witch belief more generally. As Enlightenment rationalism spread, belief in witchcraft became less respectable among educated elites. This did not mean it disappeared. Folk belief in witchcraft persisted longer. But the legal and theological structures that had supported witch trials gradually eroded. Fourth, changing gender relations. Very slowly, over centuries, women's social position improved in some respects. They gained some legal protections. The most extreme vulnerabilities of poor elderly women were reduced. This did not eliminate gender-based persecution, but it changed some of the dynamics that had made witch accusations so common. Fifth, medical and psychological frameworks. Eventually, the development of psychology and psychiatry provided new ways to understand phenomena like mass hysteria and psychogenic illness. When groups of people experience strange symptoms, doctors might diagnose collective hysteria rather than demonic possession. This medicalized explanation replaced the supernatural one, at least in official contexts. The last execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in 1782, in Switzerland. A woman named Anna Goldie was executed for supposedly causing illness in a child through witchcraft. Her case caused controversy even at the time, and is now seen as a judicial murder. It marks, more or less, the end of the era when European legal systems took witchcraft accusations seriously. But folk beliefs persisted longer. In rural areas of Europe, people continued to believe in witches, in curses, in magical harm well into the 19th and 20th centuries. They just stopped bringing these beliefs to official courts. Instead, they dealt with suspected witches through community action, social ostracism, mob violence, or consulting folk healers for protective magic. Even today, in some parts of Europe, older folk beliefs about witchcraft persist in attenuated forms. They appear in folklore, in customs, in things people say half-jokingly but perhaps half-seriously. An old woman who glares at you in the marketplace and then you have bad luck. Is it her evil eye? Of course not, that's superstition. But maybe you avoid her anyway, just to be safe. The penis theft panic specifically ended earlier than witch belief generally. By the mid-17th century, even people who believed in witchcraft generally found the specific claim about penis theft less credible. It came to seem like an embarrassing excess of the earlier period. Why did this particular belief fade faster than witch belief generally? Perhaps because it was more easily challenged. A doctor could examine a man who claimed his penis had been stolen and demonstrate that it was present. The physiological implausibility became harder to ignore as anatomical knowledge improved. Other witch accusations, causing death by magic, raising storms, attending Sabbaths, were harder to definitively disprove. Or perhaps because it involved a level of sexual explicitness that became increasingly uncomfortable as European culture became more sexually prudish in some ways. By the 18th century, the detailed discussions of male genitalia in which trial records might have seemed vulgar and unseemly. Or perhaps simply because enough time passed without major panics that the belief lost its cultural momentum. Beliefs need to be constantly reinforced through repetition and social confirmation. Once a generation grew up without hearing much about penis theft by witches, the belief became strange and antiquated rather than immediate and plausible. Whatever the precise mechanism, by the 18th century, when Enlightenment writers looked back at the witch trials, they cited penis theft accusations as examples of past absurdity. These accusations became emblematic of the superstition and credulity that the Enlightenment claimed to have overcome. Historians who study the witch trials have debated various aspects of the penis theft panic and its significance. One debate concerns numbers. How many people were actually accused of penis theft specifically? How many were executed for this specific charge? The records are incomplete and scattered. We know of dozens of well-documented cases, but there were likely many more that left no surviving records or only appeared as one charge among several in broader witchcraft trials. Some historians have estimated that across Europe over the course of 2 centuries, hundreds of people, almost all women, were executed on charges that included sexual witchcraft, with penis theft being one common specific accusation. But precise numbers are impossible to establish. Another debate concerns interpretation. Was the penis theft panic primarily about gender and patriarchy? About psychology and mass hysteria? About social and economic stress? About theology and belief? Different historians emphasize different factors. Feminist historians have generally emphasized the gendered nature of the accusations and their function in maintaining male dominance. They see the penis theft panic as part of a broader pattern of using accusations of sexual deviance to control women's behavior. Social historians have emphasized economic and community tensions. They analyze which specific women were vulnerable to accusation and why, often finding patterns related to poverty, property disputes, and community conflicts. Historians of mentalities and culture have focused on reconstructing what people believed and why. They try to take seriously the theological and demonological ideas that shaped how medieval people understood their world, rather than dismissing these as mere superstition. Historians of psychology and medicine have studied the phenomenon as an example of mass psychogenic illness and have compared it to other historical and contemporary cases. Some historians have criticized what they see as overly sympathetic interpretations of witch hunters and accusers. They argue that emphasizing the sincerity of belief can minimize the real harm done and can obscure the elements of sadism, misogyny, and cruelty that were also present. Other historians have argued that demonizing witch hunters as monsters obscures more than it reveals. They contend that understanding how ordinary people participated in witch trials is crucial if we want to understand how such episodes can occur and perhaps prevent similar things in the future. There are also debates about how witch trials should be taught and remembered. Some argue they should be presented primarily as feminist history, emphasizing the persecution of women. Others argue for a broader framework that includes attention to class, age, religion, and other factors. Still others argue for comparative approaches that situate European witch hunts in relation to witch hunting and religious persecution in other times and places. These historiographical debates matter because they shape how we understand not just this particular historical episode, but broader questions about gender, power, belief, justice, and social violence. Much of what we know about the penis theft panic comes from primary sources, documents written during the period when these events occurred. Understanding these sources and their limitations is important. The most famous source is the Malleus Maleficarum itself, printed in 1486. This book is available in various editions and translations. It makes for disturbing reading. The clinical tone with which it discusses torture and execution, the detailed theological arguments justifying the persecution of witches, the specific instructions for conducting trials, all of this reveals the mindset that made the witch hunts possible. But we must remember that the Malleus was a prescriptive text, not a descriptive one. It described how its authors thought witch trials should be conducted, not necessarily how they always were conducted. Its influence was great but not absolute. Trial records from various German, Swiss, and Austrian courts provide much of our specific information about individual cases. These records vary greatly in detail. Some are brief summaries. Others include extensive testimony, confessions, and verdicts. Many are in Latin or medieval German and require specialized knowledge to read. These trial records present interpretive challenges. They were written from the perspective of the prosecuting authorities. They record what the accused said, but filtered through interrogation, translation, and transcription. The accused themselves almost never wrote anything that survives. We see them only through the eyes of those who condemned them. Some cities and regions kept detailed records that allow historians to reconstruct patterns. We can see which months saw more accusations, which types of women were more vulnerable, how verdicts related to specific factors. But many records have been lost over the centuries, destroyed by fire, war, neglect, or deliberate disposal. Personal letters, diaries, and chronicles from the period occasionally mention witchcraft cases. These sources can provide valuable perspectives different from official court records. They show how literate contemporaries, not directly involved in trials, viewed these events. Theological and medical treatises from the period discuss witchcraft and sexual magic. These sources reveal educated debates about whether and how witches could cause sexual dysfunction. They show the range of opinions that existed among scholars and demonstrate that even learned men disagreed about many details, even while accepting the basic premise that witchcraft was real. Sermons from the period sometimes addressed witchcraft. Preachers warned their congregations about the dangers of witches, told cautionary tales, and urged vigilance. These sermons were often printed and circulated, spreading ideas from one region to another. Legal handbooks and commentaries guided judges and lawyers in how to handle witchcraft cases. These texts reveal the legal frameworks within which accusations were processed. They show what kinds of evidence were considered acceptable, what procedures should be followed, what punishments were appropriate. Pamphlets and broadsides, cheaply printed materials for popular consumption, sometimes described recent witch trials. These were the sensationalist journalism of their day. They emphasized the most shocking details and reinforced public fears about witchcraft. They contributed significantly to the spread of witch panic. All of these sources require careful interpretation. They were produced by particular people with particular perspectives and particular purposes. They reflect the assumptions and biases of their time. They often contain information that is unreliable or distorted. Modern historians must work like detectives, piecing together information from multiple sources, trying to distinguish what probably happened from what people believed happened, understanding the contexts in which documents were produced. The absence of sources from the accused themselves is a major limitation. We can try to imagine their perspectives, but we are largely hearing only one side of the story. This is true of much historical documentation. It tends to preserve the voices of the powerful while silencing the powerless. Some historians have tried to read trial records against the grain, looking for moments where the accused's authentic voice might break through, or where gaps and contradictions in the official record might reveal suppressed truths. This is difficult and speculative work, but it represents an attempt to recover something of the experience of the accused. Looking beyond medieval Europe, we can find related phenomena in other times and places that help illuminate the penis theft panic. In parts of West Africa, particularly Nigeria and Ghana, there have been modern cases of penis theft panic. In these cases, men claim that their penises have been stolen or shrunk, usually through magical means, often allegedly by a stranger who bumped into them or shook their hand. These cases sometimes lead to mob violence against the accused thieves. These modern African cases are obviously different from medieval European ones in many respects. They occur in different cultural contexts, with different explanatory frameworks, different social structures. But there are also striking similarities: the sudden perception of genital theft, the accusation against a specific person, the collective belief that sustains the panic, the violence against the accused. Anthropologists have studied these cases and proposed various explanations. Some emphasize economic anxiety. The panics often occur during periods of rapid social change and economic uncertainty. Some emphasize anxieties about masculinity in contexts where traditional gender roles are being challenged. Some emphasize the role of traditional belief systems about magic and curses. In various Southeast Asian cultures, Koro epidemics have occurred periodically. These involve beliefs about genital retraction rather than theft by another person, but they share the element of mass psychogenic illness affecting male genitals. The largest documented Koro epidemic occurred in China in 1966 to 1967, affecting thousands of people. In India, there have been cases where men accused others, particularly members of marginalized communities, of using magic to cause impotence. These accusations sometimes led to violence. These comparative cases suggest that anxiety about male genital integrity may be a cross-cultural phenomenon that manifests in culture-specific forms. Different societies have different explanatory frameworks: witches in medieval Europe, magic in modern Africa and Asia, but the underlying anxiety may be similar. At the same time, the specific consequences vary enormously. In medieval Europe, accusations led to formal legal proceedings, torture, and execution. In modern cases, they might lead to mob violence, or to medical intervention, or to simply fading away after brief panic. The legal and institutional context matters enormously. Comparing these cases also highlights what was distinctive about the medieval European version. The elaborate theological framework, the formal legal procedures, the systematic documentation, the connection to broader campaigns against heresy and witchcraft, these were specific to European context. The gendered nature of accusations was also particularly pronounced in medieval Europe. In most modern Koro cases, there are no accusations against women. The panic is about individual affliction, not about persecution of a group. The medieval European penis theft panic was bound up with misogyny in ways that some other related phenomena are not. Let us consider more carefully the psychology underlying the penis theft panic. What psychological mechanisms made this belief possible and sustained it? First, there is the phenomenon of somatization, the expression of psychological distress through physical symptoms. A man experiencing anxiety, guilt, or depression might develop psychosomatic sexual dysfunction. His psychological distress becomes manifest as a physical inability to perform sexually. In medieval culture, psychological explanations for distress were not available. The concept of psychosomatic illness did not exist. So when a man experienced what we would now understand as psychosomatic impotence, he needed some other explanation. Witchcraft provided that explanation. Second, there is confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs. Once a man decided he had been cursed, every failed sexual encounter confirmed the curse. Any successful encounter could be explained away as the curse being temporarily weakened. The belief became unfalsifiable. Third, there is the power of suggestion and expectation. If a man believes he has been cursed and cannot perform sexually, that very belief can cause the dysfunction. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief in the curse produces the symptom, which confirms the belief, which strengthens the symptom. Fourth, there is attribution error. The tendency to attribute one's own failures to external causes while attributing others' failures to internal characteristics. When a man experiences impotence, he is motivated to find an external explanation that preserves his self-image. Blaming a witch serves this psychological need. Fifth, there is the availability heuristic, judging the likelihood of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If a man had recently heard stories about penis theft by witches, this explanation would be readily available when he experienced sexual problems. The more such stories circulated, the more available this explanation became. Sixth, there is social proof, the tendency to believe something is true if others believe it. When a community experienced a witch panic, individuals were more likely to interpret their own experiences through this lens because they saw others doing so. The collective belief validated individual beliefs. Seventh, there is the fundamental attribution error in attributing malevolent intent. When bad things happen, humans have a tendency to assume intentional causation rather than accident or natural causes. If a man becomes impotent after arguing with a woman, he might assume she deliberately cursed him rather than considering the argument itself caused stress that led to dysfunction. Eighth, there is motivated reasoning. The unconscious tendency to process information in ways that suit one's emotional needs or goals. A man who needed to escape an unwanted marriage or explain failure might unconsciously process ambiguous information in ways that supported a witchcraft accusation. Ninth, there is the role of anxiety and fear. High anxiety impairs critical thinking and makes people more susceptible to explanations that offer clarity and someone to blame. The generalized anxiety of living in plague-ridden, war-torn, economically unstable medieval Europe created conditions where witch panic could flourish. 10th, there is dissociation, the psychological mechanism by which people can genuinely fail to perceive parts of their body normally. Under extreme stress or in certain psychological states, people can experience their bodies in distorted ways. Some men might have genuinely perceived their penises as absent or altered due to dissociative processes. These psychological mechanisms are not unique to medieval Europeans. They operate in all human populations. What varies is the cultural content that fills these psychological forms. Modern people experiencing similar psychological processes might develop different beliefs. Perhaps about medical negligence, or toxic chemicals, or electromagnetic radiation, or any number of contemporary explanations for distressing symptoms. Understanding these psychological mechanisms helps explain how sincere belief in something false can develop and spread. It reminds us that the men who made accusations and the authorities who prosecuted them were not necessarily cynical or evil. They were humans whose psychological vulnerabilities were activated by their cultural context. Shame played a central role in the penis theft panic, though it is rarely explicitly discussed in the historical sources. Understanding the dynamics of shame helps explain the intensity and spread of the phenomenon. Male sexual failure was profoundly shameful in medieval culture. Masculinity was defined significantly through sexual potency and the ability to father children. A man who could not perform sexually was failing in a fundamental aspect of his gender role. This was not just personally distressing but socially humiliating. Shame is a uniquely painful emotion. Unlike guilt, which is about having done something wrong, shame is about being wrong, about one's fundamental inadequacy as a person. Shame makes people want to hide, to disappear. It is associated with feelings of worthlessness and defectiveness. When a man experienced impotence, he experienced shame. This shame was intolerable. It threatened his sense of self and his social standing. He desperately needed to fully understand the penis theft panic. We need to understand medieval conceptions of masculinity and how threats to sexual function threatened male identity. In medieval European culture, masculinity was not understood as a stable, inherent quality. It was something that had to be constantly performed and maintained. A man could lose his masculinity through various forms of failure or degradation. Sexual potency was central to masculine identity. A man was expected to marry, to consummate that marriage, to father children, particularly male heirs. These were not just personal matters but social obligations. A nobleman who failed to produce heirs jeopardized his lineage. A peasant who could not father children failed in his duty to provide labor for the next generation. But masculinity was also proven through other means. Physical strength, courage, authority over household, success in one's occupation, provision for one's family, honor and reputation. These various dimensions of masculinity were interconnected. Failure in one area could contaminate others. Impotence threatened this entire structure. If a man could not perform sexually, his fundamental claim to masculinity was in question. And if his masculinity was in question, so was his authority in his household, his standing in the community, his rights to property and inheritance. Medieval medical theory linked sexual function to overall health and vitality. According to humoral theory, sexual potency indicated proper balance of the bodily humors, particularly the hot and moist qualities associated with masculine vitality. Impotence suggested an unhealthy imbalance, possibly indicating deeper physical or spiritual problems. There was also a connection between sexual potency and spiritual health. Some medieval theological traditions viewed male sexual performance as a kind of divine favor. God granted fertility and potency to the righteous. Sexual failure might indicate divine disfavor, punishment for sin. This meant that impotence was not just embarrassing but potentially spiritually significant. A man experiencing impotence might worry, "What have I done to displease God? What sins am I being punished for?" This added a layer of anxiety and guilt to the already distressing physical problem. The public nature of medieval life made sexual performance particularly exposed to social scrutiny. In societies where multiple generations lived in small spaces, where beds were often shared, where privacy as we understand it barely existed, sexual activity was not as private as it is in modern Western societies. If a married couple was not producing children, the community would notice and speculate. Moreover, as mentioned earlier, some marriage contracts could be challenged if consummation had not occurred. This meant that sometimes sexual performance had to be quasi-publicly verified. The humiliation of being examined to determine whether one had successfully consummated a marriage was profound. Young men faced particular pressures around proving their sexual capacity. First sexual experiences were anticipated with both excitement and anxiety. Stories circulated about wedding nights, about tests of manhood. A young man's reputation could be established or damaged based on early sexual experiences. Older men faced different pressures. As men aged and sexual function naturally declined, they might experience this as a loss of masculine status. In a culture that valued sexual potency so highly, aging was not just a physical process but a social demotion from full masculinity toward a more ambiguous status. This context of masculine anxiety helps explain why accusations of penis theft emerged when and where they did. These accusations appeared at a time when traditional masculine roles and identities were under various pressures: economic changes, religious upheaval, warfare, disease. When masculinity feels threatened more broadly, specific threats to sexual function become even more intolerable. The penis theft panic was also entangled with one of the central theological problems of Christianity: the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful and all-good, why does evil exist? Why do bad things happen to good people? Medieval theology had developed elaborate answers to this question. Evil existed because of the fall of man. Adam and Eve's original sin had corrupted human nature and brought suffering into the world. Evil also existed because God granted humans free will, and they sometimes chose to do evil. And evil existed because demons, fallen angels who had rebelled against God, actively worked to cause harm. The devil and his demons were real, active forces in the medieval worldview. They were not metaphors or abstract concepts but literal beings with intelligence, will, and power. They sought to destroy human souls, to lead people into sin, to spread misery and suffering. But there were limits to demonic power. Demons could not act against God's will. They operated only within boundaries God permitted. They could tempt, deceive, and afflict, but they could not destroy God's creation or overcome God's ultimate plan for salvation. This theological framework created interesting questions about witchcraft and magical harm. If witches, through demonic power, caused impotence or stole penises, how did this fit into God's providential order? Why would God allow such things? Some theologians argued that God permitted witches to operate as a test of faith or as punishment for human sinfulness. A community afflicted by witches was being chastened by God, called to repent and reform. Individuals cursed by witches might be experiencing divine correction for their own sins. Other theologians emphasized that demonic power was limited. Demons could create illusions but not truly transform matter. They could affect the senses but not alter reality. This suggested that penis theft was not real physical theft but a glamour, a deception that made men perceive their members as missing when they were actually still present. This theological debate had practical consequences. If penis theft was merely illusion, then perhaps prayer and faith could dispel it. The proper response was spiritual, confession, penance, prayer, sacraments. But if penis theft involved real physical action by demons, then perhaps more aggressive intervention was needed, exorcism, or prosecution of the witch whose pact with demons enabled the harm. The existence of witchcraft posed a challenge to divine omnipotence. If witches could cause such dramatic harms, did this suggest that God's control was limited? Orthodox theology insisted that God was always in ultimate control, but explaining exactly how this worked while still allowing for real demonic and human evil required sophisticated arguments. Some theologians emphasized divine permission. God permitted evil to exist for reasons humans could not fully understand, perhaps to bring about greater goods or to allow for free will and moral responsibility. Evil was real and caused real harm, but it ultimately served God's inscrutable purposes. Others emphasized divine providence. Nothing happened without God's knowledge and consent. If a man was cursed with impotence, God had allowed this to happen. Perhaps it prevented him from committing sexual sin. Perhaps it was punishment for past sins. Perhaps it was a test. Whatever the immediate cause, God was working through it toward some good end. These theological frameworks meant that victims of witchcraft were caught in a difficult position. They were suffering genuine harm and deserved sympathy. But their suffering might also indicate their own sinfulness or spiritual weakness. They needed both assistance and moral examination. Similarly, witches were understood as both criminals and victims. They had chosen to make pacts with demons, which was a grave sin. But they had also been deceived and corrupted by demons, which made them in some sense victims of demonic manipulation. They needed to be punished to protect society and uphold divine justice. But they also needed to be offered opportunity for repentance and salvation of their souls. This theological complexity often got lost in actual witch trials, which focused on punishment rather than salvation. But the theological framework shaped how people understood what was happening. Witchcraft was not just crime, it was spiritual warfare, a battle between divine and demonic forces with human souls as the battlefield. We have traveled a long way through this disturbing chapter of European history. We have examined the medieval penis theft panic from many angles: theological, psychological, social, legal, economic, cultural. We have tried to understand both the beliefs that made such accusations possible and the human suffering those beliefs caused. What final observations can we make as we conclude this long meditation? First, we should recognize that the people involved in these events, accusers, accused, judges, witnesses, executioners, were human beings like ourselves. They were not alien monsters from an incomprehensible past. They had hopes, fears, loves, anxieties. They lived in a different world with different knowledge and different beliefs, but their basic humanity was the same as ours. This recognition is important because it cuts both ways. It should generate compassion for those who suffered. The women tortured and executed, the men experiencing agonizing sexual dysfunction and shame. But it should also give us pause about our own certainties. If intelligent, sincere people in the past could believe things we now know to be false, and could participate in injustices they thought were righteous, what might we believe and do that future generations will judge harshly? Second, we should recognize the real harm caused by false beliefs. The penis theft panic was not just an interesting historical curiosity. It killed people. It destroyed lives and communities. Ideas have consequences. What we believe about the world shapes how we act, and our actions affect others. This places a moral obligation on us to think carefully about what we believe and why. Third, we should recognize the importance of institutions and systems. The penis theft panic flourished where certain legal systems enabled it. Systems that used torture, that presumed guilt, that rewarded accusers and prosecutors. When those systems changed, the panic could not sustain itself. This suggests that preventing similar injustices requires not just right belief but right institutions, legal systems with protections for the accused, standards of evidence, skepticism toward coerced confessions. Fourth, we should recognize the particular vulnerability of marginalized groups. The women accused of penis theft were disproportionately poor, elderly, socially isolated. They lacked power and protection. This pattern repeats throughout history. Those without power are most vulnerable to scapegoating and persecution. Protecting the vulnerable requires conscious effort and institutional safeguards. Fifth, we should recognize the power of fear and anxiety to distort thinking. The penis theft panic occurred in a time of tremendous social stress. Plague, war, religious conflict, economic disruption. In such times, people are more susceptible to panic, more willing to believe in threats, more likely to support harsh measures against perceived enemies. Understanding this pattern might help us respond more wisely during our own times of stress. Sixth, we should recognize the difficulty of maintaining skepticism when surrounded by others who believe. When a community experiences collective belief in something, dissenting is hard and sometimes dangerous. Most people will go along with the crowd, even when they have private doubts. Creating space for dissent, protecting those who question dominant narratives, is crucial for preventing mass delusions. Seventh, we should recognize that good intentions do not prevent harm. Most people involved in witch trials probably believed they were doing good. Protecting their communities from evil, upholding divine justice, defending victims of malevolent magic. Sincerity and good intentions are not sufficient safeguards against causing terrible harm. We need more than good intentions, we need wisdom, humility, and constant questioning of our own certainties. Eighth, we should recognize the complexity of historical causation. The penis theft panic cannot be reduced to a single cause. It resulted from the intersection of theological beliefs, psychological vulnerabilities, social structures, economic pressures, legal systems, gender relations, and specific historical circumstances. Understanding complex historical phenomena requires attention to multiple levels of causation. Ninth, we should recognize the importance of listening to marginal voices. The sources that survive from the witch trials primarily preserve the perspectives of those in power. Judges, theologians, accusers. The voices of the accused women are largely silenced or filtered through hostile interpreters. Yet their perspectives matter profoundly. We should be attentive to whose voices are preserved in our own historical moment and whose are excluded. Tenth, and finally, we should recognize that understanding past injustices does not automatically prevent future ones. Knowledge of history is valuable but not sufficient. Each generation must actively work to build just institutions, to resist fear and scapegoating, to protect the vulnerable, to maintain space for dissent and questioning. The witch trials ended not because people suddenly became enlightened but because specific individuals worked to change laws, challenge assumptions, and build better systems. The medieval penis theft panic is over. No one today fears that witches are stealing penises. But the human vulnerabilities that made that panic possible, anxiety about masculinity and sexuality, susceptibility to social contagion, willingness to scapegoat the marginalized, tendency to believe harmful things when our communities believe them, these vulnerabilities remain. We live in a different world with different challenges. We have different fears and different scapegoats. But if we wish to avoid repeating the patterns of past injustices, we must remain vigilant. We must question our certainties. We must protect the vulnerable. We must insist on just procedures and reliable evidence. We must maintain humility about what we know and compassion for those who suffer. The study of history is not just about understanding the past. It is about developing wisdom for the present and future. The medieval penis theft panic, for all its strangeness, has lessons to teach us. About belief and knowledge, about justice and injustice, about human vulnerability and human cruelty, about how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary harm, and about how courage, skepticism, and institutional reform can eventually end even deeply entrenched patterns of persecution. As we conclude this long examination, we might pause to remember those who suffered in these events. The women tortured and killed. The men experiencing shame and dysfunction. The communities torn apart. They lived and died long ago, but their experiences were real. Their pain mattered. Their stories deserve to be told and remembered, not as entertainment or as evidence of our superiority, but as sober reminders of what humans are capable of, for both good and ill, and as invitations to vigilance in our own time. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The specific content changes, but the structures and patterns persist. By understanding the penis theft panic of the 15th and 16th centuries, we may become slightly wiser about the panics and persecutions of our own age. And that understanding, translated into wisdom and action, might help us build a more just and compassionate world. This is the work of history. Not just to catalog the past but to illuminate the present. Not just to judge those who came before but to better understand ourselves. Not just to remember what happened but to think carefully about why it happened and what it means. And so we close this long meditation on a strange and terrible episode of European history. We have examined it from many angles, in hopefully monotonous detail. We have tried to understand it in its complexity, without either dismissing it as inexplicable superstition or reducing it to a simple morality tale. The medieval penis theft panic happened. It was real. People believed these things and acted on those beliefs. And those actions had consequences that rippled through communities and generations. May we remember. May we learn. May we do better.